Blood Summons by Kayla Grigoletti. Abigail's eyes snap open to the sound of a soul-chilling keen, a scream so sharp it pierced through her heart and into the center of her body, an ungodly wail that she recognized with an unshakable dread. Sweat began to glisten along her arms and legs. She jumped out of bed and ran for the concealed window at the other side of her bedroom. Pulling back the dark brocade drapes, the moonlight invading the once blackened space, her eyes frantically searched the fields for the source of the screams, but no form appeared. The forest surrounding her home protected their secrets well, but the wailing of the banshee continued into the night. "Quiet, you witch!" Abigail cried out, holding her head in her hands as the tears began to well up. They were tears of madness, of a dozen nights just like this where the banshee had called out to her in desperation. Of course, she knew that by giving these noises a name meant Abigail willingly gave it the power to breach her sanity. "We cannot hear it, darling," Margaret would say in an attempt to soothe her child's fragile mind. Duncan simply observed with distaste, proclaiming over and over that banshees are an old folk tale meant to scare children back into their beds. Whatever his daughter thought she heard, logic proved that it was impossible. But she heard it. She knew deep down that this mythical being was hunting her. The reason she could not guess. Every night for the past month has been plagued by the banshee's screeching. When Abigail first heard the call of the wicked woman, she did what a normal person would do. Rationalize it. It was an owl, she told herself, or the cries of some wounded animal. By the fifth night, she felt compelled to investigate the source of the screaming. With a flashlight in hand, she slipped out the back door of her family's cottage and set off into the night. Abigail knew the safest path to take since she was a lass. The moors became a second home to her, each blade of grass and bloom of heather familiar. Even if she were to wander the hills miles outside of the village, she would always find her way back. No one can ever be lost in their homeland. She took the long way around the houses along the outskirts of town, despite their dark windows and sleeping inhabitants. If the neighbors knew she was sneaking out her house at this ungodly hour, they would surely tell her parents. They acted like they were an extension of her family. Her late-night strolls would somehow be misinterpreted and bring shame to her house. Abigail made sure to stay far enough away from prying eyes as she headed east towards Loch Tay, and then up north into the moors. Once outside the reach of Killin, she hunted the screams to the highest hills and up the slopes of the loch, but the sounds faded away once the sun crested over the horizon line. For 3 more nights she tried to follow the keen and screeches of an unknown entity, but with no sign of its source. When proof of the voice eluded her, she turned to research for answers, typing into any search engine on the World Wide Web she could find about a creature that screamed and could only be heard by one, but not others. The name Banshee kept coming up. Despite its mythical origins, a wailing woman with an emaciated body that curses men and women to their deaths. Images of skeletal forms or shadows that stalk the mortal men of this world to take their souls to the other world. The more she read about this dark creature, the more convinced she became that it was calling to her. Abigail tried to show her parents the old tales she learned, but their Christian heritage kept them blind to the possibilities. And now the voice is back. The Keens have returned, and her mother's promises that this will go away eventually have not come. "Abigail," the screeching called, stinging her eardrums with malice. Shock and awe contorted her face. The banshee had called her name for the first time. Until tonight, she had merely bellowed uncontrollably until dawn. Her heart froze to solid stone when she heard the creature call her out. She wanted to back away from the window, close the curtains, and retreat back into bed. But a silhouette grew into form in the distance. 2 eyes that shone like green stars were pointed directly on the window she stood in. The figure raised a hand towards her, beckoning her to join. It opened its mouth wide and released a vile scream, a sound that can only be described as evil. Abigail no longer felt the skin on her body, growing numb as an otherworldly power swept over her. In all her readings, every story about the banshee that she had collected since this nightmare began, it was rare to escape the call of this creature. Those who had were declared insane. She knew in her bones that to meet this thing face to face would bring misery upon her that no person could ever imagine. And yet the desire to prove her theory true compelled her to follow. Without a thought, she scurried down the hall and snuck past her parents' bedroom before taking the stairs 2 at a time. Not even bothering to put on shoes or a coat, she rushed outside into the cool spring evening. The moon sat full in the eastern sky, casting shadows from the trees onto the form before her. Abigail started out at a walk towards the creature, but with every step she took toward the shadowy figure, it fell back 2 paces. The woman continued to call out in whispers, like a breath on the wind, so quiet one almost believed they imagined it. Then she screeched her name as if ordering Abigail forward. Her feet knew the safe way through the heather and along the banks of Loch Tay. The night-chilled air whipped her auburn curls about her face and into her eyes. She frantically brushed the mess of hair out of her vision so as not to lose sight of the banshee. The water lapped softly at the shoreline, kissing her bare feet with frigid waves. Even in these warmer days, Scottish waters can still freeze your blood cold. Abigail jogged up a rough patch of terrain to catch up with the creature, and took in the ruins of Finlarig Castle. The banshee was now standing at its walls in wait. The green shimmer in her gaze never wavered from Abigail, pulling the young woman towards the remains of Scottish history. Flashes of memory from her youth play out at the sight of the old tower house. Castle is a bit of a misnomer, considering the size is nowhere near as impressive as a true castle would have been in those days. The L shape to the 400-year-old stonework has worn away after years left to nature's will. It appeared to have only 2 levels, and the wooded interior had rotted away over a century ago. She and Ben, an old playmate from her childhood, would sneak away after school to explore the abandoned monument. They would pretend to be Scottish rebels as the filthy redcoats stormed the castle, using broken sticks as swords and holding out their thumb and index finger in an horizontal L, as pistols. They would run and jump about till exhaustion claimed them, or they pretended one of the British had shot them, play-acting some heroic death. Why did the banshee lead her here? Why take her so far away, only to die? Abigail approached the ruins, but the banshee stayed in place this time. She really was waiting for her victim. No more chases into the dark, no more ear-shattering keens. She stood silently and took in the woman that she summoned on this dreadful journey. Abigail wanted to break their interlocked eyes, if only to shake the awful sensation that the creature held upon her soul. But there they were, looking to each other in perfect silence. For some reason, she focused on the scent of fresh grass and pure mud, that perfectly Scottish smell that reminded her she was not dead yet. "What do you want, Banshee?" she bucked up the courage to ask. The figure shook her head and replied in a hoarse, sickly voice, "Banshee is what they call me now, but that is not my name." "Then what are you?" Abigail's eyebrows furrowed together in confusion. "You already know the answer." She searched her brain for any memory or note of the banshee tales she had collected that may spark the answer from her. No other creature in Celtic lore screeched like this creature did, at least not in womanly form. Images of banshees resemble this dark silhouette figure with straggly hair and piercing eyes of pure light that guided humans across the Scottish Highlands. There were other names for banshees, elder titles in old languages that may hold the key to this puzzle. Banseath was one of them, but that came from the Irish Gaelic. This thing was a Scot. Her voice betrayed that heritage, and then she remembered. She knew the true name of this deadly, mythical being. Ben-Nia. That's your ancient name, isn't it? She said matter-of-factly. The shadow of a woman nodded in approval. All right, Ben-Nia. You've come to kill me, I assume? No. That response gave Abigail pause. I thought that's what you do. Curse mortal souls to die. I am a prophet of death, not the giver. I am the warning in the darkness, a shadow of knowledge. You will not fade away this night, but you will soon. The figure circled Abigail and watched every flinch and motion she made. What do you mean? The Ben-Nia ignored this question and at last turned away to look upon the castle. Abigail will never be certain of this, but she thought she witnessed a smile on the shadow's black lips when her shapeless hand touched the old stone. Do you know this place? The shadow asked almost innocently. Everybody in Killin has seen or at least heard of Finlarig, but what— You did not ask me why I have brought you here, the creature interrupted. That is usually the first of 1,000 questions when I call upon the cursed. It's not a terrible place to learn how you're going to die, I suppose. The Ben-Nia's laughter croaked and stuck in her throat as if she choked on the very action of giggling. Do you know who owned this castle? Abigail stepped closer to her and pressed her hand against the spot the shadow had. The Campbells built it. Its head nodded knowingly. That's right. Your family's blood is in this stone, and your ancestors lost it when King George's men in red invaded your land. The Campbell legacy. A ruined stone building and all their riches taken by the British after the 45 rebellion ended in failure. Scotland has not known freedom since Mary, Queen of Scots, reigned, and not once have the clans been strong enough to stand against the English army. Abigail's great-grandfather, Samuel Campbell, used to tell her all about the glory days when Campbells were lairds and chieftains of the Highlands. Apparently their riches and influence spread throughout Scotland. But the legacy of the Campbells in the year 2004 was a failing produce shop and a cramped cottage with a leaking roof. That time had passed, where they were lords over men and beloved as fair leaders long ago. Your ancestor, Saoirse Campbell, lost her life here for housing Jacobite rebels. The Ben Nia hovered her shapeless hand over Abigail's shoulder and guided her eyes to the hole in the foundation. A short ramp at a slight decline fell into an open cellar-like room beneath the ground floor of the home. Weeds and moss covered the wet gray stones now, but Abigail knew what that room used to hold. The redcoats, mad with anger and blood rage, took your great-grandmother to the mouth of that cave and shot her, letting her body roll down into the dark alongside her children. How do you know all this? I was there when it happened, child. Shall I show you? Abigail barely touched the stone slide as the Ben Nia flooded her mind with a vision. Saoirse Campbell, a beautiful woman in her day, now lay on the damp earth with blood and bruises tainting her flesh. Her dress had been flayed to ribbons after the British had mocked and scorned her for wearing the clan colours in her skirt. She was barely conscious and could no longer fight, despite the massacre of her kinsmen being played out before her very eyes. The pain of a dozen boots and fists left behind after the beating left her paralyzed. Rain began to trickle down from heaven and wash away the evidence of murder. 2 men approached the prone lady of the Campbell clan and lifted her by the pits of her shoulders to her feet. She stumbled and tripped as the soldiers brought her to the pit where they had discarded the corpses of her sons, Hamish, Fergus, and Lucas. Matthew cried for mercy to his wife behind her, but the British would see no quarter given to traitors of His Majesty. The lieutenant bashed Matthew's nose with the butt of his rifle to silence him. "My love," Saoirse declared, twisting her head back to look upon her man for the last time. "You and I will be with God soon. Our sons and I will be waiting." Her calm voice startled the surrounding audience of soldiers, but gave peace to the remaining inhabitants of Finlarig. She faced her death not in fear or grief. She welcomed it. "Shoot the witch already!" a redcoat ordered, and only a second later, Saoirse Campbell's life went black. Her body fell into the pit to rot and waste away. The vision felt all too real for Abigail, the scent of blood and decomposition lingering in her nose to the point of nausea. She could feel her ancestors' pain in her stomach and back from the hands of the British. She knew what they did to her. They made her suffering last long and unrelenting. The tears she now shed as the sobs escaped her throat felt like they belonged to Saoirse, but Abigail was the one free to express that sorrow. "Now you know," the Ben Nia sighed. "Her life was brought to an end because she did not heed my warning." "What warning?" Abigail whimpered, falling to her knees in grief at the loss of her sons. No, not her sons. They were Saoirse's. But when she looked through her eyes into their lifeless faces, that felt real. When a Scot loses one's land, what is left of them? I don't understand." Her voice broke to speak, but the creature would not explain more than necessary. "Know this, Abigail Margaret Campbell. If you do not regain what your ancestors lost that day, your death will come just as swiftly. There will be nothing and no one to save you." The Ben Nia voiced her final warning before disappearing into the shadows of the trees. Her form evaporated in front of Abigail, leaving nothing but a breeze in its wake. She shuddered in relief at the loss of such a devilish presence. Thoughts raced to the beat of her quickening heart, and she truly felt the effects of madness on her mind. The words she spoke made some sense to her, and despite the obvious reservations she should have about listening to a creature who foretold of her death, Abigail believed it. She believed that if the Campbells did not return to the path their ancestors had laid down for them, all would be ruined. Scotland died the day English won at Culloden Moor. Someone had to bring them back to life, and if it had to be her, then so be it. September 18th, 2014, Voting Day. Abigail sat on the edge of her couch, listening to the news anchor's report on the latest polls. She had waited so long for this. A decade of protesting, teaching, and orating about the possibility of a free Scotland. This was their country's one shot at finally being released from the Queen's grasp. The British Parliament would not be able to decide the future of Scots anymore. James reached for his wife's hand and smiled at the look of anticipation she wore. Ever since they met in university, all she could think about was freeing their nation once and for all, that perhaps she could fix the mistakes of their ancestors over 300 years ago. Even though her attention never wavered from their television screen, he knew how much this vote's results meant to her. The journalist's eyes widened in shock, and a heavy sigh escaped her. The results are in, ladies and gentlemen. It was a tight race, but the noes have it. The vote for Scottish independence has failed, with the yeses only having 44% of the votes, and the noes had 55%. Abigail's skin turned ice. Her heart froze. All this time had passed since the Ben Nia gave her warning, told her she must free Scotland if there was to be peace in this land, peace for her. Why? What had gone wrong? Who did not want to see their country free? A high-pitched keen struck her ears in that second. All this time she never forgot those screams. And she did not forget the creature's promise either.